I have been asked, in the years since, what I was thinking when I set the folder on the table. The honest answer is that I was not thinking much at all. I was tired. I had been tired for 11 years. The precise length of time the Sovereign Commission had been processing Earth's application for full galactic membership. And by the morning of the final adjudication, tiredness had become something more structural. It lived behind my eyes. It was in the way I sat, the way I breathed, the way I stopped caring whether my collar was straight before I walked into a room. My aide, a young man named Calder, had tried to fix the collar in the lift on the way up to the chamber floor. I let him. It did not seem to matter one way or the other. Very little about my appearance in that chamber was going to matter in the way I had once believed such things mattered. What I want to do here is tell the truth about what happened in that chamber on the morning the Commission issued its final adequacy determination, because the versions that have circulated since, the heroic ones, the ones that make me sound like I had a plan from the beginning and executed it, cold precision across a decade, are not accurate, and I am old enough now not to need the glory of a story shaped to fit my vanity. My name is Aaron Voss. I served as Earth's senior representative to the Sovereign Commission for 11 years, 3 months, and 12 days. I no longer hold that post. The post no longer exists, which is, depending on how you look at it, either the saddest sentence I have ever written or the most satisfying one. Let me tell you how we got there. The Sovereign Commission was not, by its own description, a political body. That was the first thing they told you when you arrived, and they told you with the particular confidence of people who have been saying something for long enough that they have ceased to notice whether it remains true. It was a standards body, a certification authority. You did not petition it for membership in the galactic community. You applied to be evaluated against the codified adequacy framework. And if you met the framework's requirements, membership in the community followed automatically as a matter of administrative procedure. No votes, no negotiations, no politics. This was, of course, a lie. Everything about the Commission was political. But it was a very old and very tidy lie. And the Commission had been telling it for so long that most of its own members appeared to have forgotten it was one. They believed in the framework's neutrality, with the particular confidence of people who have never had any serious reason to doubt it, which is to say, people who had always been on the determining end of the process and had never needed to think carefully about what the process felt like from the other side of the table. The Codified Adequacy Framework was a document of 1,140 pages in the base language, which translated, in the standard rendering our office used, to approximately 3,000. It had been written over several centuries by Commission scholars and revised at irregular intervals, always by Commission scholars, always by consensus of the full Commission membership which Earth was not yet part of, and therefore could not influence. It covered everything. Your planet's governance structures, your military posture and its declared justifications, your trade practices, your environmental stewardship, your treatment of populations within and outside your borders, your diplomatic history and its record of agreements honored or broken, your cultural practices as assessed against a baseline of galactic norms, your technology level and its applications, your rate of territorial expansion, your communications protocols, your religious and philosophical frameworks, and their influence on civic life. It was, in scope, a complete audit of what you were, and what you had been, and what your patterns of behavior suggested you would become. The framework was exhausting to read, but not on its own terms, unfair. I say this without bitterness, because I want to be precise about where the problem actually lived. The framework's text, taken at face value, was a reasonable document. The standards it articulated were ones that a species genuinely integrating into a galactic community had good reasons to meet. Problems were not in the text. Every applicant species went through the framework. Every one of them passed, in time. The Commission made a point of this. It was in the literature they gave you when you filed your initial application. The process was rigorous, they said, but it was fair. It was designed not to exclude but to prepare. Every species that had ever completed the evaluation had been welcomed into the galactic community. The process worked. What the literature did not tell you And what I learned only through years of sitting in that chamber was that the framework's requirements were not fixed. They were interpreted. The Commission's adjudicators had broad discretionary authority to apply the framework standards contextually, meaning, in light of the particular qualities and circumstances of the applicant. This discretionary authority was described in the framework itself as a feature. It allowed the process to be responsive to the genuine diversity of galactic life, to avoid the rigid application of standards developed for one set of circumstances to a species whose circumstances might legitimately differ. It was presented as a form of generosity, a recognition that a truly fair process could not be a merely mechanical one. In practice, it meant the Commission could move the line whenever it chose. For most applicants, this flexibility was generous. Species with a difficult colonial history might have their territorial expansion record assessed sympathetically. A species emerging from a recent civil conflict might have their governance stability numbers weighted against a longer baseline that smoothed the damage. A species whose communication protocols were idiosyncratic might have the standard adjusted to fit what they were actually doing, rather than requiring them to rebuild systems from scratch. The contextual interpretation smoothed the path. It made the process, for most applicants, kinder than the raw text of the framework would otherwise suggest. It was, for most applicants, genuinely what the Commission described it as, a mechanism for fairness. I have met representatives of species who went through the Commission's process and came out grateful for exactly this quality. The discretion was used to help them pass. It was used carefully and in good faith. For us, the contextual interpretation had a different character. Our territorial expansion rate was assessed not against the Commission's standard baseline, against an adjusted baseline that accounted for what the adjudicators called the historically accelerated acquisition pattern of Terran origin entities. Our governance stability was assessed not against the standard metric but against a modified metric that weighted our electoral volatility, entirely normal, by any reasonable measure, for a functioning representative democracy, as a risk factor requiring compensatory evidence. Our military posture and its declared justifications were assessed not against the standard framework, but against a separate addendum, the special review provisions for technologically asymmetric applicants, which had not existed before our application, and which was adopted by Commission vote partway through our evaluation and applied retroactively to our file. Our cultural practices were assessed under a provision that required what the Commission called demonstrated sustained divergence from territorial expansion-associated behavioral patterns over a minimum of 2 complete generational cycles, a standard that, as near as I could determine, had never been applied to any other applicant in the Commission's recorded history. Our environmental stewardship figures, which were genuinely strong, were assessed under a separate provision that discounted improvements made within the evaluation period as potentially evaluations motivated rather than structurally embedded, which meant that the evidence most directly responsive to the Commission's stated concerns was, by definition, insufficient to address them. Our diplomatic history was reviewed under an evidentiary standard that treated any use of military force in defense of existing agreements as evidence of a propensity for conflict, regardless of the circumstances that had produced it. I want to be clear about the mechanism I am describing. The Commission did not tell us that we would not be admitted. They never said anything so plainly false as that. What they did, at each stage, was find a legitimate and documented reason why the evidence we had produced did not quite meet the applicable standard, and then articulate what a more complete demonstration would look like. The guidance was detailed and specific. It was designed to be followed, and when we followed it, the standard had moved, and the new guidance was issued, and we followed that. Every time we met a standard, the standard moved. Not dramatically. Not in a way that any single adjustment taken alone was impossible to justify. Each one had a rationale. Each rationale was documented. The documentation was thorough and internally consistent. The adjudicators were not careless. They were, if anything, unusually careful. The care of people who know they are building a record that will need to hold up and have done the work to make it do so. If you read any one piece of it in isolation, you might find it reasonable. I spent years reading it in isolation, when I was newer and more willing to believe that the problem was my understanding of the process rather than the process itself. The first 3 years, I worked on the basis that we had genuine deficiencies the Commission had identified accurately, and that the path forward was to address those deficiencies as thoroughly and credibly as we could. We filed compliance demonstrations. We submitted supplemental documentation. We retained additional specialist advisors in every category the Commission had flagged. We engaged with the adjudicators' queries in good faith and at considerable length. I personally appeared before the adjudication panel 11 times in those 3 years, each time with what I believed to be a complete and persuasive record of Earth's progress on whatever the current outstanding issue was. People received our presentations with professional attention. The documentation was accepted into the record without objection. The adjudicators' questions were precise and engaged, not hostile, not dismissive, genuinely interrogating the material we had brought. I came out of several of those sessions believing sincerely that we had made progress, that the gap was closing, that we were within reach of the threshold. At the conclusion of each session, the panel would take the matter under advisement and issue a written determination within the procedurally required timeframe. The determinations were consistent, thorough, documented, internally coherent, and always finding some element of the presented evidence insufficient or some category of the standard not yet fully met, with detailed guidance about what additional evidence or demonstration might address the remaining gap. I responded to the guidance. We produced the evidence. We addressed the gaps. New gaps appeared. The gaps were always just ahead of us. Not so far ahead that the process seemed designed to be impossible. The Commission was too practiced for that kind of crude transparency. But far enough ahead that we were always arriving at where we thought we needed to be and finding the destination had moved. It had the quality of a horizon. You can see it perfectly clearly from where you are. It recedes at exactly the pace at which you advance. By the 4th year, I had stopped believing the problem was our evidence. I had not yet arrived at a clear accounting of what the problem actually was. I had only a growing sense, carefully suppressed, because I had not yet found a way to act on it, that the game I was playing had rules I had not been told. I tried to find those rules through the Commission's own processes. I filed procedural queries about the basis for specific baseline adjustments. I requested clarification of the evidentiary standards applied to categories where we had been found wanting. I submitted formal objections to 2 of the framework amendments that had been applied to our file, and asked, in each case, for the Commission's explanation of why the amendments applied retroactively. The responses were thorough. They were documented. They cited precedent. Precedent existed, and articulated principled reasoning where it did not. The precedent was sometimes thin. The principled reasoning was sometimes strained. But it was never absent, and it was never obviously wrong by the Commission's own standards, which were the only standards that mattered in that chamber. Calder was the one who finally put it in front of me in a form I could not dismiss. 26 years old, when he joined my team as a junior research analyst, the youngest person I had ever taken on in that role, and he had a quality I came to prize above almost any other in that environment. He was genuinely indifferent to the Commission's opinion of him. He did not need them to find his work credible. He did not need to believe they were fundamentally fair. He could look at what was actually in front of him without the protective instinct, which I had spent years cultivating, and which took me considerably longer to shed than it should have, to make what he saw mean something more tolerable than what it plainly said. He was, in short, not invested in the conclusion I had spent years needing to avoid. He came to me 8 years into the evaluation with a set of charts. He had gone back through the Commission records, not just Earth's file, but as for every applicant in the Commission's recorded history, which was publicly available to all parties, too, buried in a documentation repository that required considerable patience and a working knowledge of the Commission's archival indexing system to navigate effectively. Most delegations, as far as I could tell, had never accessed it. The repository was technically open, but it was not designed to be easy, and most delegations were too busy managing their own current evaluations to go looking at what had happened to other applicants in the preceding 2 centuries. Calder was not too busy. He spent 4 months in that repository. He had pulled the baseline metrics used for each applicant's assessment in each category and compared them across the full historical record. He had standardized for species-specific factors that might legitimately require different baselines. He had accounted for the framework's own evolution over time. He had been careful and methodical, in a way that made the result harder to argue with, not easier. The pattern was not subtle once you could see it. For every species that had passed through the Commission in the preceding 2 centuries, the contextual baseline adjustments had run, on average, slightly in the ACLA favor, small adjustments in most cases, a few that were quite significant, for applicants whose situations genuinely warranted generous interpretation. The overall effect was that the Commission's process was, as its literature claimed, generous. Contextual flexibility was used as it was described, to accommodate, to smooth the path, to give the benefit of the doubt where doubt existed. Every contextual adjustment in every category for 8 consecutive years had run against us. Not a single one, across 8 years and 47 separate assessment categories, had been applied in our favor. Not one. The adjustments were, individually, defensible. Collectively, they described direction so consistent it could not have been produced by the random variation of reasonable judgment, applied in good faith. Calder had done the statistical analysis with care, showing his work at each step, in a way I could follow without trusting him to be right. Probability of that directional pattern occurring by chance was not marginal. It was, for practical purposes, 0. I sat with his charts for a long time. Then I took them to our senior legal advisor, a woman named Okafor, who had been doing commission work since before I was posted, and who trusted very little and believed nothing the commission told her as a matter of professional discipline. I asked her what they meant for our position. She looked at them for a shorter time than I had. They mean, she said, that the commission has no intention of passing us. I asked how that could be squared with their record. Every species that had ever completed the evaluation had been welcomed into the community, she said carefully. Every species that had ever completed the evaluation. That's the language. Question is whether they intend to let us complete it. I asked what happened to a species that did not complete the evaluation. She told me. An application could be deferred indefinitely, on the grounds that the applicant had not yet achieved a satisfactory score in one or more categories and required additional time to demonstrate compliance. There was no maximum deferral period specified in the framework. There was no provision requiring the Commission to establish one. A species could, in theory, remain in perpetual evaluation, measured, assessed, found wanting, on some newly interpreted standard, for as long as the Commission chose to continue the process. The framework had been in operation for several centuries. Its oldest deferral on record was still technically active. She paused, and then added the sentence that clarified everything I had been circling for years without being able to name. In practice, species in indefinite deferral tend to reorganize their political and economic structures around the assumption of eventual membership. Their trade agreements assume it. Their territorial commitments assume it. Their military postures are constrained by it because the framework's assessment bills pennies disproportionate armament relative to current needs. And the Commission gets to define both. After enough years, the evaluation doesn't confine you through exclusion. It confines you through the hope of inclusion. You cannot build toward what you actually are while you are building toward what they have decided you need to become. Becomes the governing fact of your life as a species. Because everything you do is shaped by whether it will help you pass. She did not need to spell out what that meant for us specifically. We had been calibrating our posture for 8 years against the assumption of an evaluation we intended eventually to pass. Every position we had taken in every bilateral negotiation, every territorial decision, every assessment of our military requirements had been shaped, in part, by what we believed the Commission's adjudicators would think of it. In significant part, for an audience that had already decided what it thought of us, and had decided, with complete sincerity, that its decision was an objective standard. I went back to my office and sat in the dark for a while. What I came to understand in that darkness was not that the Commission was corrupt. Corruption implies that the rules are good and the people are bad. What I understood was something more dispiriting. The rules were the instrument. The Commission did not need to be corrupt to use them this way. It needed only to believe, as I think most of its members genuinely did believe, that Earth's full admission to the galactic community would be balanced, destabilizing, that we were too large, too energetic, too difficult to predict, too willing to reshape whatever we entered, and that the framework's interpretive flexibility provided a legitimate and defensible mechanism for delaying that event indefinitely while the Commission continued, in good conscience, to describe its process as fair. They were not lying to themselves about the rightness of the outcome they wanted. They believed the adjustments were appropriate. They believed, as powerful institutions almost invariably do, that their judgment of what was good for the community was itself a form of objectivity, and that an objectivity-grounded process could not, by definition, be unfair. The subjective had been laundered through enough procedure that it had come out the other side looking like a standard. The people applying the standard believed in it. That was the most important part. You cannot negotiate with people who believe they are being fair because they will process your objections as evidence of your misunderstanding rather than their error. I sat in the dark for a long time. Then I turned the lights back on and called Calder and Okafor and the 3 other members of my senior team and told them we were going to do something that would feel strange and that required a specific kind of nerve. Not the dramatic kind, not the defiant kind, the steady kind that does not need an audience and does not expect applause. I told them what it was. Okafor was quiet for a moment. She is not a person given to long silences, which made that particular silence meaningful. Then she said, "You're sure?" I said I was. She thought about it for perhaps 10 seconds. "All right," she said, not enthusiastically, not reluctantly, with the tone of someone at the arithmetic, and reached the same answer by a different path. That was the last substantive discussion we had about the decision. We spent the next 3 years executing it without telegraphing it through any of our formal communications. We continued attending sessions. We continued filing documentation. We continued responding to the adjudicators' queries with the same careful preparation we had always brought to them. We gave no indication that anything had changed in how we viewed the process or what we intended to do at the end of it. Those 3 years were, in their own way, the hardest of the 11. The earlier years had been hard because I believed we might fail. These were hard because I had stopped believing we could succeed, and yet I had to behave, in every formal setting, exactly as though I had not. I had to walk into that chamber and engage with the process as though the process were worth engaging with. I had to file compliance demonstrations and sit across from adjudicators, whose questions I answered with care, knowing that the answers would be received politely and found insufficient for reasons that had already been determined. I had to keep producing the evidence of good faith for a record that I was building for a different purpose than the Commission believed. Calder managed it better than I did. He had the advantage of never having needed to believe in the process in the first place. Okafor managed it by directing her energy, during those 3 years, into the withdrawal document itself. She rewrote it many times, sharpening the language until she was satisfied that every sentence was both accurate and unimprovable. By the time the final hearing arrived, she had worked on it for nearly 2 years, and the 14 pages that resulted were as close to the plain truth as we could make them, in the fewest words that would still say everything that needed to be said. We were not performing good faith for an audience that did not deserve it. We were doing something more specific. We were removing every variable from the Commission's final determination that might later be used to suggest that our departure was a reaction to something we could have addressed differently, or a failure of patience, or an error of strategy. When we left, the record would be unambiguous. We had done everything the process asked. The process had found us wanting anyway. There was nothing left to interpret, and nothing left to argue, and no version of the story in which we were the party that had failed to try. The Commission's final adequacy hearing was held in the main adjudication chamber, the largest formal space in the Commission's primary facility, a room designed, I had always thought, to make individuals feel precisely as small as the Commission required them to feel while still maintaining the fiction that the proceedings were collegial. The tiered seating rose in a full arc around the floor on 3 sides. The observation gallery above was filled, which was unusual. Several hundred beings in total, representing most of the Commission's member species, in attendance for what the Commission's communications office had apparently described as a significant proceeding for Omrsthansel had attracted interest across the membership, not all of it sympathetic. There were species in that chamber who had been quietly supporting a negative determination for years. Not out of hostility toward us specifically, because our full admission would shift certain trade and security balances they found unfavorable, and because the Commission's framework gave them a clean way to oppose us without having to say so directly. Fate. There were species who were genuinely neutral and watching with something that resembled academic curiosity. They had no stake in the outcome, or so they believed, and they wanted to see how 11 years of evaluation would resolve. There were a few who had communicated to us, through the careful channels available for such communications, that they hoped we would succeed, though none of them had said so publicly, because the Commission's procedural rules classified open advocacy for an applicant's cause as a conflict of interest that could result in mandatory recusal from any subsequent vote. The Commission's rules were very thorough about this kind of thing. The adjudication panel occupied the curved bench at the front of the chamber, 7 members, each representing one of the Commission's founding constituencies, presided over by the senior arbiter, a being named Thessaly Ondrak, who had held the position for longer than most of his colleagues had been alive, and who conducted proceedings with the precision of someone who has repeated a ritual so many times that the ritual has become the whole of his relationship with what the ritual is supposed to mean. He was a large creature, broad-shouldered, the ceremonial head wrap of his office framing the elongated cranial ridge of his species, the deep amber eyes carrying the settled expression of a being who expects this proceeding to go exactly as all the others have gone. He was not wrong to expect that. That was exactly what we were counting on. The hearing opened with formality lengths that I will not describe at length, because I have sat through enough of them that I cannot reconstruct this particular instance without merging it with a dozen others. The Earth delegation was welcomed. The evaluation record was entered. The Commission's final adequacy summary was presented, a document of some 600 pages, transmitted to us 3 days prior as required by procedure. I had read it. Calder had read it. Okafor had read it twice and made notes in the margins. The summary confirmed what we had expected. After 11 years of evaluation, Earth's application had been assessed as failing to meet the required standard in 3 categories. 2 of those categories were ones we had demonstrably met. The assessments had been reinterpreted using the adjusted baselines Calder had documented. The third was a new category, added to the framework by Commission Amendment 14 months prior, applied retroactively to our file under the Contextual Interpretation Authority. The arbiter summarized the findings in his measured, neutral voice. He confirmed that the Commission's preliminary determination was to defer Earth's application pending further compliance demonstration in the 3 outstanding categories. He noted that the Earth delegation had the right to submit a formal response before the determination was finalized. He looked at me. I stood. I reached into the folder on the table in front of me and removed a single document, 14 pages. I set it on the table. I did not hand it to the arbiter. I did not present it to the panel. I did not speak. I set the document on the table, picked up my bag, at Calder and Okafor and my team, and they stood and we walked out. Not quickly, not slowly, not storming, not making a scene of it. We walked, at a pace that was unhurried and deliberate, toward the chamber door, which Calder reached first, and held open, and we walked through it, and the door closed behind us. I was not in the chamber, for what followed. I was told about it afterward by a source whose account I trust, and I will relay what I was told. But I was already in the corridor when it happened. Well, what I am told is that the chamber was silent for approximately 4 seconds. Particular silence of a large room, in which several hundred beings all encounter the same unexpected things simultaneously, and none of them have yet found a category for it. The arbiter looked at the document on the table. He looked at the door. He looked at the document again. Then there was sound. My source describes it as the collective response of the chamber to a situation the room's architecture had not been built to contain. The arbiter called for order. He achieved partial order. He picked up the document. I am told he read the first page twice. What was on those 14 pages was not a rebuttal, not a counter-argument, not a request for reconsideration, not an appeal to the Commission's discretion, not a legal challenge to the retroactive amendment, not a plea for equitable treatment. I had written all of those at various points across 11 years and filed them through the proper channels, and they had been received and addressed and dismissed, always with thorough documentation, always with rationales that were, in their own terms, internally consistent. What was on those 14 pages was a withdrawal, not a conditional suspension, not a strategic pause designed to invite a counteroffer. A complete, unconditional, permanent withdrawal of Earth's application for membership in the Sovereign Commission's recognized galactic community, effective immediately and irrevocably upon submission. The document cited no grievance. It made no accusations. It did not allege that the process had been unfair or that the Commission had acted in bad faith. It was not, in any legal or procedural sense, complaint, and it was not designed to invite a response or open a negotiation. It stated that Earth was withdrawing its application, thanked the Commission for the time and attention it had devoted to the evaluation, and noted that Earth considered itself released from all obligations and commitments undertaken in connection with the application process, including, specifically, the military and territorial posture constraints Earth had accepted as conditions of ongoing evaluation under the special review provisions, and wished the Commission and its member species well. It was signed by me and by my government's full executive authority. The 14th page contained a single paragraph that I had spent more time on than any other element of the document. I want to write it here from memory, because I believe I have it right. The Sovereign Commission's process was designed to evaluate whether Earth met the standards for galactic membership. We participated in that process for 11 years in good faith and at considerable cost. We have concluded, based on the totality of the record, that the process was not designed to arrive at a determination on its own terms but to produce indefinite procedural extension, an outcome that had been decided in advance. We do not say this with anger. We say it because we believe it is accurate, and because an accurate statement of our understanding of the situation is a more respectful farewell than one that does not say what we actually think. We wish the Commission no harm. We ask for none in return. We are done. I understand that the arbiter read that paragraph several times. The Commission's internal response in the immediate aftermath was not what we had anticipated. We had expected anger. We had expected a formal motion to issue a negative determination, carried downstream consequences for our standing in the community. We had expected procedural escalations and formal demands for our return. What my contact described, instead, was the silence of an institution that had encountered something it was never built to model. The Commission's leverage over applicants, its ability to shape their postures and their policies across decades of evaluation, rested entirely on the assumption that membership was desirable enough that no species would voluntarily forgo it. The indefinite deferral mechanism worked because applicant species kept believing, however long it took, that the door would eventually open if they were patient enough and compliant enough. Remove that belief, and the mechanism had nothing to operate on. We had removed it, not theatrically, not with a speech or a declaration of defiance. We had looked at what the process actually was, concluded that it was not a process we needed to complete, said so in 14 pages, and left. The Commission's formal response came 3 weeks later. It expressed regret at our withdrawal and invited us to reconsider, noting the Commission's readiness to engage in constructive dialogue about the framework's application to Earth's specific circumstances. It did not acknowledge the pattern in the assessments. It was the document of an institution that had decided our withdrawal was a negotiating posture and was waiting to see what we were asking for. I did not respond. This was, I was told later, the element they had not anticipated. They had expected a counterproposal within weeks. When none came and the months continued, and Earth went on doing what it had always done, trading, building, extending bilateral relationships, expanding steadily without asking permission. The Commission gradually understood that we had not made a move. We had ended a game. What came after is known well enough that I do not need to narrate it at length. Earth's trade relationships, previously constructed with careful attention to Commission sensitivities, were renegotiated on terms that reflected our actual position rather than our aspirational one. Truth. Our territorial commitments were recalibrated without the posture constraints the framework had imposed. Most bilateral agreements with individual species were maintained because practical benefit tends to outweigh institutional loyalty when the two are in direct conflict, and most species, whatever their formal position within the Commission structure, found the economic relationship with Earth worth preserving on its own terms. And then other things happened that I had not planned for and will not claim credit for. There were species within the Commission's outer membership who had their own reasons for chafing under the framework's authority and who found in what we had done a possibility they had not previously considered. Within 4 years of our withdrawal, the Commission was managing 6 similar withdrawal requests and a formal petition signed by 11 member species requesting a comprehensive review of the framework's interpretive provisions. The petition was, by Commission standards, unprecedented. It was also, by my reading, inevitable. The only reason it had not arrived sooner was that the Commission's structure had prevented the species with grievances from organizing around them, and Earth's departure had demonstrated that organizing around them was not, in fact, the only option. I was retired by then. I watched most of it from a considerable distance, in a house on a coast I will not name, in weather that was generally pleasant, and I did not feel the way I had expected to feel. I had expected to feel something larger, vindicated perhaps, or relieved. What I felt, mostly, tired in a different way than the tired of 11 years. A useful tired, kind that follows the completion of something, rather than the indefinite endurance of it. Okafor retired 6 months after I did. She called once, to say she had stopped reading Commission communications and recommended I do the same. I told her I already had. There is a version of this story in which I am heroic, in which I saw clearly from the beginning what the Commission was, and played a long and patient game that ended in a masterwork of institutional clarity on a single morning. People tell that version. I have heard it told many times, and I understand why it circulates. It is a more satisfying story than the accurate one, and people prefer satisfying stories to accurate ones when both are available. The accurate version is that I spent the better part of a decade trying, with genuine effort and increasing desperation, pass a process I still believed, against accumulating evidence, could be passed on its own terms. The person who showed me clearly what was actually in front of me was 26 years old, and had arrived at the job without my particular need to believe that important institutions were, at their core, fair. The decision I finally made, when I could no longer avoid it, was not tactical or heroic. It was simply the only response that made sense once I stopped trying to meet a standard that was designed to keep moving. I have been asked whether I regret not pressing harder within the process, filing the legal challenge to the retroactive amendment, escalating more aggressively through the Commission's internal review mechanisms, cultivating more openly the member species who were sympathetic to our position. I did file the legal challenge, The Commission's internal tribunal reviewed it and dismissed it with a 15-page rationale that was, in its construction, genuinely careful work. I escalated through the internal review mechanisms 4 separate times across 11 years. Faced the sympathetic contacts as carefully as the Commission's conflict of interest rules allowed. All of it is in the record. All of it was processed and resolved through processes that were, by the Commission's own standards, scrupulously fair. The question is not whether I pressed hard within the process. The question is whether I understood early enough that pressing harder inside a process designed to defer you indefinitely is simply a more vigorous way of being deferred. Every additional argument, every additional evidence filing, every additional procedural challenge was something the Commission's process had been designed, across centuries of operation, to receive and resolve. It was very good at resolving challenges to itself. That was, in a sense, its primary function. The Commission's most powerful tool was not the framework. It was not the interpretive adjustments. It was not the deferral mechanism. The most powerful tool was the belief, which we had held for 8 years without seriously questioning it, that the correct response to an unfair process was to engage with it more skillfully. They needed us to believe that. Without it, the whole apparatus had nothing to hold us with. The process was only as powerful as our willingness to keep treating it as a process we needed to complete. The door was not the cage. The belief that the door would open was the cage. I think about the chamber sometimes. The tiers of seats rising on all sides, curved bench and the 7 panel members. The arbiter with his practiced neutral voice and his amber eyes that had conducted so many proceedings, he had perhaps forgotten what they were for. The quality of a room that expects to do to you what it has done to every applicant who has ever stood, measure you, find you wanting, defer you, watch you return more compliant than before. I think about the 4 seconds of silence after the door closed. I do not know what the arbiter was thinking in those 4 seconds. I suspect he was thinking several things at once, not all of them easy. He had been doing this for a very long time. He understood the Commission's process as thoroughly as anyone living. He was not, I think, a stupid being, and not a cruel one. He believed the process was appropriate. He may have believed it more completely than most. I think those 4 seconds contained, somewhere in them, a version of what it feels like to have built something very large and very thorough and very defensible, and then watched it fail at the specific seam where it was never designed to hold. The point where the person standing in front of you simply stops wanting what you control. There is no procedure for that. There is no form to complete and no guidance to issue and no standard to point to. The machine is built for applicants. It does not know what to do with someone who is no longer applying. I do not know. I was already in the corridor. We set the folder on the table. We walked out. The door closed. And somewhere behind that door, the old institution sat with 14 pages it had no procedural framework for, and began slowly to understand that the world it had been managing for several centuries had just acquired a shape for which it had no map. That was enough. That was, in the end, exactly enough.